In an essay first published in 2002, Nicholas Cook posed the following questions about syntax and form. When you ask, what is musical form or what is musical syntax, the question implies that there are things like musical forms and syntaxes out there, so to speak, just waiting to be discovered. But is such an assumption warranted? Should we see form and syntax as psychological categories? Or are they really metaphorical constructions coming into being only by virtue of our interrogation of the music, our attempt to understand it? While these questions may at first seem naive, I take them to be central with respect to developing frameworks for uncovering the various coordinates between orchestration and form. As listeners, we all sense intuitively that orchestration plays a vital role in our experience of form. And as we gather here today, working together to define the emerging study of orchestration, I'd like to briefly address a question that hovers silently in the background of our collective enterprise. Do we require a syntax for timbre in order to build meaningful theories of orchestration, and in particular to assess any contribution that orchestration makes to musical form? Stressing the felt experience of music, Leonard Meyer proposed that to qualify as syntax, quote, successive stimuli must be related to one another in such a way that specific criteria for mobility and closure are established, end quote. Recently, Rochmeyer and Pierce distinguished between syntax on the one hand and the elements of musical structure on the other, arguing that musical syntax is a formal characterization of the principles governing permissible sequential structure in music. It characterizes sequences of musical events generated from a lexicon of building blocks and a set of rules governing how the building blocks are combined. The precise identity of these building blocks is one of the central ongoing research questions in musical syntax, end quote. They use the term musical structure to reference the way in which one or more pieces of music may be represented in terms of their constituent parts. And here they mean anything that can be represented like dynamics, timbre, rhythm, etc. A survey of the many attempts to formulate musical syntax reveals two basic factors that receive consistent emphasis. First and foremost, an affective expectancy that is predicated on implicit learning. Here, pretty much everyone agrees with Leonard Meyer's early observations concerning tension and closure. Second, some type of generative structure of abstracted components, often influenced by Chomskyan linguistics. However, attempts to find or formulate a syntax for timbre fail to demonstrate hierarchy and undervalue or even outright ignore the affective factor and its important emphasis on expectation and closure. The quest for a syntax for timbre begins with a short aside found at the end of Arnold Schoenberg's 1911 theory of harmony. Schoenberg acknowledges the duality of tone color as a conflation of pitch and timbre and asks whether they can be adequately separated. Reading this early formulation of Klangfarben melody as being fully commensurate with modern notions of syntax is slippery at best and hinges on the equivocal meaning of the term logic. It is, however, noteworthy that Schoenberg acknowledges an affective component to pitch logic in his idea of satisfaction as it is rendered in this translation. The mantle was taken up nearly 80 years later by both Fred Lerdahl and Stephen McAdams. In his quest for syntax, Lerdahl distinguished between associative and hierarchical components of musical organization. Speculating, as Schoenberg had, but here with an even more utopian twist, Lerdahl states that timbre has traditionally functioned associationally, but if it can be organized and perceived hierarchically, the listener will infer a much richer structure than otherwise. The prospect of constructing a complex timbral organization only out of associations does not seem promising. According to Lerdahl, in order to exceed association, syntactic formulations of timbre require timbre intervals. perceptible units whose sequential relations resist transposition. Writing 2 years after Lerdahl, McAdam defends timbre as a form-bearing dimension of music. In order to be capable of bearing form, dimensions must be attributes that influence auditory grouping. They must have the potential for integration into hierarchical event structuring, and they require encoding of intercategory relations, such as intervals, in order to be integrated as abstract knowledge structures. The quest for syntax would seem to depend heavily on the discovery of intelligible intervals for timbre. However, very few empirical studies address the perceptual salience of timbre intervals, and the ones that do remain inconclusive. Results suggest that timbre intervals may not work for acoustic instrument tones because instrument identity may get in the way. Christopher Wood recently observed that listeners were generally unable to reproduce specific interval sizes. However, McDermott, Lair, and Oxenham demonstrated that in addition to pitches themselves, contour can be tracked as brightness over time, and that contours presented in one dimension, such as pitch, can be apprehended in another, such as loudness or brightness. At the very least, these findings suggest that sequences are not exclusive to pitch. That is, they are not predicated on graded steps alone. Ultimately, timbre intervals may be impossible to realize as a basis for composed music. But not so with tone color contours, especially when we give up the attachment to thinking of pitch and timbre as separate, but somehow equal. Contour can be a multidimensional phenomenon. But leaving metaphysics aside, the remainder of the presentation will briefly outline the preliminary stages in ongoing work to find more ecologically valid ways of approaching orchestration and form. I'd like to stress that this is but one way forward, and that many other vantage points will be necessary in order to develop a coherent picture of the abundant interactions between orchestration and form. We can begin by proposing that some degree of apprehension is intended by composers in their structuring of orchestration as an experiential unfolding. Klangfarben melody is a sequential process for the apprehension of timbre as foregrounded at the local level, and these timbre melodies can be experienced as contours. The mnemonic structuring of contour is another way to ensure coherence, but across a larger time scale and with much more subtlety. The smoothness of such a contour is triggered by the music, but it is rendered within experience by memory. These contours are in fact mnemonic grouping structures predicated on the repeated but disjointed presentation of sonic icons. Sonic icons must be easily imprinted and easy to recognize in order to be experienced across an entire work, and timbre clearly plays a role in their proliferation. I'd like to demonstrate, however imperfectly, one small component of such a contour, taken from the prelude to Schoenberg's Gürrelieder. Making use of an unusually large orchestra, Schoenberg paints a stunning and incredibly subtle sunset that lasts around 11 minutes, crossing seamlessly from the prelude into the first song of his cantata. To do so convincingly requires an intricate formal contour, whose trajectory seeks to deliver a sunset to our long-term experience of the music. His design for this trajectory involves multiple, discrete, and interleaved icons whose individual formal destinies intertwine. Together, the intricate design and ordering of these icons and their various repetitions and developments combine to form a unified singular formal contour. My demonstration will indeed fail, and I won't be able to convince you with such a brief example. Since the message that binds a large series of instances together here is the medium, it is sound experienced over time. But I assure you that to hear the same music played at the piano leaves something to be desired, and it's that elusive something that we're all here chasing after. Just a quick note about the sound excerpt. Pitch here is very salient. It's a series of harmonic sequences, but I'd like to encourage you to focus on the orchestration itself. the 3 excerpts, and each is separated by about 1 second of silence. They together, they represent points along a 7-minute segment of this large contour. Let's listen. Some important mechanisms that make large-scale mnemonic contour plausible have already been demonstrated. For example, the fine-grained auditory characteristics of short excerpts make lasting impressions in both long and short-term memory. In a stunning demonstration, Agus et al. Showed that multiple configurations of short bursts of white noise could be recognized days and even weeks after initial exposure. Moreover, even without the presence of a pitch syntax, so-called surface features of music register as highly salient, and timbre plays a critical role in shaping this salience, especially in non-tonal contexts that lack intercategory relations and abstract knowledge structures that are present in tonal music. Empirical research further shows that memory integrates cues derived from different perceptual attributes such as pitch, rhythm, timbre, and harmony. Together, these studies show that there is a cognitive architecture for a feature like timbre to be memorized without any syntactic relations. Large-scale mnemonic contours provide us with an opportunity, grounded in the music itself, to generate new findings and novel approaches for timbre as orchestration form. This particular project demonstrates that Schoenberg had timbral strategies for both the local level as well as for the large-scale development and proliferation of orchestral timbre along a mnemonic contour. This approach points to what I hope are productive modes of analysis that I'm currently working on. Additionally, a contour approach to form and orchestration has utility not only for tonal works such as the one we just heard, but also compelling implications for spectral music and related types of process form. Finally, this approach has an immediate correspondence to orchestral scores, as well as to the experience of the music itself. I'll conclude with a quote from composer Tristan Murail. He says, "We need, in fact, new organizing principles that do not exclude one or more categories a priori, but integrate the totality of sonic phenomena. There is no such thing in itself as a beautiful or an ugly sound. Sounds are beautiful or ugly as determined by their contexts. In general, their qualities are perceived as a function of the energy directing the musical work in which they figure," end quote. Murail's sonic nominalism points to the reflexive relationship between sound and time, between timbre and form, as each requires the other in order to make meaning. The medium here is the message, and the message is the medium. Thank you.
All right, thanks for a great presentation. Time for questions, so feel free to either raise your hand or just type question in the chat, or actually write out your question in the chat and I can read it out loud. So while everyone is thinking, I will start. So Thank you for this. It's interesting because we've been sort of talking about this now for over 100 years and nothing really definitive has come out. So I think it's great that you're saying something about it now, you know. So my question is, what kind of, how do you think this might inform or relate to the practice of composition and maybe even to you personally in practicing composition?
Very good question. Well, I think orchestration is not a singular thing. Of course, when we sit down to study it, we say orchestration and we know what we all mean. But as a composer, I think when you sit down to orchestrate, there's a subtle newness to each time you would do it. You're building something. I suppose in the tonal paradigm, the music very often is already made at the piano, and you're maybe adding something to it, or maybe it was written with something in mind. And certainly in post-tonal music, composers very often orchestrate as they write directly to the score. I think this has implications for just thinking about trajectories in general, that orchestration, like music, has a trajectory very often. And this provides us a starting point. If we can identify real trajectories, contours that we think we can point to, then we might learn something about how the orchestration tries to embody a contour.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. All right, Jason has a question. Jason, can you unmute yourself, or do I have to do that for you?
I think I can. Great. Thank you very much, Mo. I want to pick up on something that you said relatively early on about Stephen McAdams' list of form-bearing dimensions. And you and I have both had lots of time to think about this since we both studied with him. The question is about the word hierarchy and the requirement of hierarchical event structure. And you know, what was said was that in order to be a form-bearing dimension, then hierarchical event structure must be supported. But I feel like there's a lot of types of form in the 20th century music that abandon hierarchical structure. The most obvious would be aleatoric music, but I think minimalist music as well. And you could also make an argument for sound mass music, which is a logical continuation of Klangfarben melody in a lot of instances. And so the question I want to ask is whether or not you think there can be musical form without hierarchical event structure. And if so, can timbre be a primary parameter in such music, whether or not it supports hierarchy?
Okay. How much time do we have?
You're fine. Go.
Thank you. No, it's okay. Thank you, Jason. It's a very difficult question. Let me start first by saying that I think that Stephen's paper is a really important paper, and it outlines some concepts that I think need to be returned to. It's funny that since 1989, there has been very little written about form in tonal or post-tonal music that would really have direct ramifications for what we're doing. So I think in many ways that Stephen's paper is sort of the last effort, and it's been some time. So Stephen, I think you're probably here. I would encourage you to give us a second one. Do all forms require hierarchical event structuring? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that they necessarily do. I'm not even sure that timbre as a parameter is really the proper way to frame this whole conversation. I think that parameter conversation really is a polemic that is set up against syntax or for syntax. So if you're for harmonic syntax, you're against timbre as a parameter that can belong. If you're for timbre as a parameter, well, then we're sort of, we haven't gotten quite there yet. So I don't know if parameter is the right word or concept, but I don't know that I have a replacement for it. It's clearly, I mean, we all know, we're all here because we know it's participating. It's participating to a great degree. And what I'm, I guess, arguing for is that maybe we need to leave that debate aside, the parameter debate specifically, because I think we all agree that it's doing something. And the parameter only allows us to argue against or for a syntax. And if we abandon all of that, then I think we can start to look at the music itself and start to look at trajectories that occupy time and try to build out, based on analysis, some kind of idea of what's happening. And the other thing that the syntax question, the other way it irks me is that it assumes one syntax to rule them all, that there is this large scale thing that every other thing, every other involvement in music must bow down before a syntax. And I think that's clearly not true. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but that's the one I have.
Okay, thanks. I think for right now, we'll take one more question from Natalie, and then we'll save, we got a couple more on the board, but maybe if we have time at the end, we could come back after the next paper. So Natalie?
Yes, thank you, Mo, for this very interesting paper. I would have a question. You spoke about tonal language, post-tonal language too, and I wonder if you, based on your analytical experience, you see perhaps differences in syntax of timbre depending on tonal or post-tonal language. I wonder a little bit about the relation between tonal language and timbral or orchestration language.
I guess that would also hinge on whether there is a syntax in post-tonal music for us to sort of graft orchestration onto in order to say meaningful things. I think that I suppose that Schoenberg was really trying to liberate tones from one kind of syntax, and I think maybe his argument was that there are a multiplicity of organizational structures available. And if it's possible to reorganize pitch, then it should be possible to reorganize timbre. It's questionable how much salience the 12-tone method for pitches really produces, but clearly there are forms in post-tonal music, and clearly the orchestrations relate to those forms in meaningful ways. The question is whether we always need to tie those meaningful ways to the pitches themselves, whether that's at the local or the global structure. I'm not saying that pitch doesn't matter. In fact, quite the opposite. But if we want to say meaningful things about orchestration and how it's distinguished from tonal to post-tonal musics, then we really need to look at its behavior and its function. How is it supporting a function within the music itself? I'm not sure if that adequately answers your question, but if you have a follow-up to kind of guide me to what you were looking for.
Yeah, we can speak at another moment, but it's an interesting question for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's move on.